For centuries, an extraordinary war has raged across the world's oceans, above and below the waves.
You could kill hundreds of people with one broadside. These were extremely powerful war machines.
Shipbuilders designed bigger and faster vessels to outwit and crush their opponents.
That nation that has most powerful battleship fleet can destroy the enemy's battleship fleet and therefore control the seas. And if you control the seas, you control the world.
They carried terrifying weapons.
This was going to be the first time that somebody had fired a torpedo in anger since World War II. They needed to get it right.
But ships have also liberated and rescued thousands.
You can think of Gerda 3 as basically a lifeboat for persons hunted by the Nazis.
And inspired men and women to acts of incredible bravery.
I will take you there now, to your cannons, to your death. We will sink before surrender.
These vessels and their crews have shaped world history.
As the commanding officer of a missile-carrying submarine, I was directly responsible for helping to prevent World War III.
This time, the 6th of June 1944, D-Day.
It was the most complex naval operation in history.
Every ship had to lead by the minute, be in exact positions by the minute, all the way through.
The liberation of Europe depended on a remarkable armada of vessels.
The big battleships started firing over the top of us, and they were landing on the beach, which was 300 yards away from us.
Some were experimental, some simply dangerous.
I can't imagine how anybody could risk their life in one of these.
This is the story of the ships that turned the tide of the war in one momentous day. By the start of 1944, the Germans know an invasion of Europe by the Allies is imminent. They just don't know where or when it will happen. The Germans occupy most of Europe, and those forced to live under Nazi control are desperate to be liberated. Slave labor has been introduced on a monumental scale, and the number of people exterminated at Auschwitz stands at 2 million and rising. By May 1944, Anne Frank wrote from a secret annex in Amsterdam that everyone was talking about the possible invasion, debating, making bets, and hoping. In fact, the Allies had been arguing for 2 years about where D-Day should take place. A failed raid on the port of Dieppe in August 1942 had shown them where not to invade.
Everyone assumed that a serious-sized invasion of either England or France would need to capture a working port so that the backup could be supplied with more troops, with ammunition, food, all the rest of it, of vehicles. And so any invasion plan must include the capture of a port. Now, from Dieppe, we drew the conclusion that it can't be done. The Germans drew the conclusion this proves what the Allies are going to do.
Since Dieppe, the Germans had strengthened their coastal defences. The Atlantic Wall, as it was known, was now stronger than ever around the French Channel ports. This helped persuade the Allies to look elsewhere. They identified a 60-mile stretch of coastline in Normandy as suitable. It was 5 hours by boat from the English coast, but the beaches were wide, the sand was firm, and the German defences were weaker.
The Allied plan was to land across a relatively broad front and hopefully advance inland quite a long way.
The invasion was codenamed Operation Overlord and was led by American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The invasion's success relied on the Allies landing over 150,000 men in a single day, D-Day. The critical naval operation would have its own codename, Operation Neptune, and would be overseen by British Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay.
He was Eisenhower's sailor. He kind of knew what would be a mistake and what wouldn't.
5 invasion forces would sail from ports along England's south coast. American forces would head for beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha. The British and Canadians for Gold, Juno and Sword. From May 1944, southern England became a vast depot. There were so many trucks. Council staff in some towns were given an extra 15 minutes for lunch just to cross the roads. Supplies were hidden in woods and landing craft hidden up creeks. Thousands of troops waited for the off. Then, on the night of the 5th of June, 2,700 ships, carrying the largest invasion force the world had ever known, converged on an area south of the Isle of Wight, nicknamed Piccadilly Circus. For those who witnessed it, it was an impressive sight.
Close under the headland, I looked down on the landing craft. I could see the troops in battle dress on board. Beyond them, line after line of tank landing craft, side by side, escorted by motor launches. Out to sea, destroyers and frigates took up their stations. On the horizon, battleships and heavy cruisers waited. I said to my wife, a lot of men are going to die tonight. We should pray for them.
There was plenty that could go wrong. One of Eisenhower's team wrote in their diary that night, "I'm very uneasy about the whole operation. It may be the most ghastly disaster of the whole war." The success of D-Day and the ultimate liberation of Europe relied on a remarkable collection of vessels that gathered that night at Piccadilly Circus. As the 6th of June arrived, however, there were a few D-Day vessels that were nowhere near the Isle of Wight. 30 feet underwater off the coast of Normandy, 10 men are existing on a diet of baked beans and tea. They are the crews of 2 mini-submarines, known as X-craft. The men in submarines X-20 and X-23 had been waiting for 2 days. Their job was to erect a telescopic mast fitted with green lights and a radio beacon that would guide the first invasion vessels heading into Juno and Sword beaches.
They were there to provide the precise navigation that a landing craft emerging out of the darkness towards a beach couldn't expect to have on its own. They were there as navigational markers.
The X-craft had each been towed across the channel by an armed trawler. Now, utterly on their own, they were powered by a diesel engine from a London bus when on the surface, and by battery when submerged. A hatch gave the crew access to the deck, whilst a wet and dry hatch allowed a diver in and out. 4-ton explosive charges could be fitted and released from the control room. The explosives weren't needed on D-Day, but had been useful in carrying out the X-craft's original purpose, to find and sink German warships.
The need for smaller submarines came about with the large German battleships like the Tirpitz hiding in the Norwegian fjords, so essentially really far away from open sea, and the British ships couldn't get to them, and they protected the harbours with huge anti-torpedo and anti-submarine nets. The X-craft also had the capability of cutting through those nets, so by developing a smaller submarine, that allowed us access to the ships that could potentially cripple our navy.
The X-craft had managed to drop explosive charges under the Tirpitz and damage her, but many submarine crews had been lost in the process. The men waiting silently off the Normandy coast in early June 1944 were well aware of the dangers. Earlier that year, they'd trained in total secrecy in Scotland until the time came to move south. Jim Booth was a crew member of X-23.
He came down, I think, in May sometime. Brought our X-craft down on a lorry, actually, with a sort of big thing over it, you know. We stopped at a pub, I think, to have lunch or something, and chap said, "What have you got on that lorry, sailor?" And it looks like a mini X-craft, doesn't it? And I said, "Well, it does a bit, doesn't it?"
As early as the afternoon of the 4th of June, Jim and his fellow crew members had been in position a quarter of a mile from the Normandy shore. They were so close, they could watch German soldiers playing with beach balls. Inside the X-craft, they were dressed as French taxi drivers and workmen. If they drowned and their bodies were found, no one would think they were British submariners. That night, expecting Operation Neptune to be taking place at dawn, the two X-craft surfaced to pick up a vital coded radio message. It would be part of the BBC's 10 o'clock news bulletin.
There were two signals, and one of them was that the operation was not on tomorrow, and the other one was that it was, simple as that. They were plain language. They came something like the Mrs. Something as a cat and had 3 kittens in Little Hampton, or something like that, you see.
But Eisenhower had decided the weather was too bad for a channel crossing. D-Day was delayed for 24 hours.
Everything, oh God, yeah. Down we go again.
When D-Day was postponed for a day, these poor men had to live in this tiny tin can in disgusting conditions for a whole 24 hours more.
To be inside an X-craft, the only way I can think to describe it is almost like living in a broom cupboard. It was an extremely cramped space. They had one small bunk and that was it, so they had to take turns in sleeping.
Well, of course, you couldn't stand up anywhere, except in the periscope well. Most of the time I was sitting down, I suppose I sat down by the wheel. And then everything was, you know, it was wet and damp and that sort of thing, so it was pretty horrible. And we were young, you don't complain then, do you, when you're young?
On the night of the 5th of June, the crews surfaced once more. They received the signal they wanted. D-Day was on. By 4:30 the following morning, the subs were in position. The masts were raised and radio beacons activated.
And then there was this rather pregnant pause. We wondered what was happening when there we were sitting there, you know, like bloody fools off the beach. You know, rather frightening, really.
But whilst the X-craft waited, out in the channel, Operation Neptune was already underway. Specialised boats were gathering, ready to guide the invasion force through a massive field of floating German mines. In the summer of 1944, the fate of Europe depended on the Allied plan to land over 150,000 troops in just 24 hours on the beaches of Normandy. June the 6th was D-Day. A key part of the invasion was the cross-channel operation, codenamed Neptune. Hundreds of vessels, some untested, would transport the troops and guide them safely to shore. But deadly German minefields, beach defences and shore batteries meant that success was far from certain. Out in the Channel, in the early hours of D-Day, was a tiny flotilla of vessels. Some of the unsung heroes of Operation Neptune. These were the Harbour Defence Motor Launches, or HDMLs, built to guard British ports against the threat of German submarines. Today, one HDML is preserved and still seaworthy. HMS Medusa. Medusa was designed to evade submarines, using 2 engines that could be independently operated for extra turning power.
There's no other vessel in these days that is manoeuvred like this one. If you put one engine ahead, one engine astern and the helm over, you can actually spin the ship on a sixpence. It's a bit like driving a high-performance car on a skid pan in heavy rain and maybe fog as well. On the bridge here, we don't have direct control of the engines. We've got two brass telegraphs here, and there's a chap below my feet down in the engine room watching the dials, and he has to have his wits about him as well.
The HDMLs had one unique attribute that was foremost in the minds of the D-Day planners. The boats were made of wood, and so were undetectable by radar. To make up for the lack of armor plating, HDMLs like Medusa boasted some serious firepower.
The main armament on this vessel is 20mm Oerlikon. A good team on there can shift 400 rounds of high explosive shells in a minute. On the bridge wing behind me, there's two light caliber machine guns on each side, and these vessels were expected to get up close and personal with the opposition as well. On the bridge there's 2 buckets of hand grenades. So you went up to the other chap and chucked one through the window.
The men who took their chances on a vessel designed for such close quarters fighting were nicknamed Churchill's Pirates.
We were never dressed properly, you know. The Navy didn't like us, and we weren't really fond of the Navy.
Churchill's Pirates would have a special task on D-Day. A German minefield stretched almost the entire length of the channel. The invasion fleet could only pass through this seemingly impenetrable barrier once designated routes had been cleared by a fleet of minesweepers.
So the plan was for each of the D-Day beaches to have 2 narrow channels cut, only about a quarter of a mile wide. But of course that could only be done right at the very last moment, because otherwise it gave the game away as to where the invasion was going to take place. So it could only be done in the night before.
Medusa and other HDMLs would station themselves at the entrances to these vital channels, so that the landing craft and larger ships would know the safe route in.
I have here one of the charts from the instruction pack for Medusa for her D-Day role, and this is the German minefield that was laid. Medusa was at position 4, right at the entrance there, and ML 1383, sister ship at number 3 channel.
For this operation, Medusa would be kitted out with equipment like no other vessel before her. But for security, most of her crew were kept in the dark about exactly what that equipment did.
We had all this secret stuff on the boat. We didn't know what it was. I think their idea was that if we did get caught, we couldn't tell them anything because we didn't know anyway.
Worryingly for the D-Day planners, the Germans had learned how to jam Royal Navy navigation devices, known as the G system. But by D-Day, a new piece of kit had been devised that the Germans didn't know about. It was called Decker Radar and was switched on for the first time on the 6th of June.
This ship was the first to use Decker operationally, and at the time of D-Day there were only 20 sets available, and Medusa had one of those 20 sets. And that enabled her to fix her position very, very accurately.
The Decker system used a network of transmitters to emit signals. By comparing the time it took for the signals to reach the receiver, you could accurately plot your position on a map. But operating ahead of the main fleet, Medusa was caught in a storm that had postponed D-Day by 24 hours. Designed to operate in calm harbours, the HDMLs struggled in high seas.
We would probably have to fight our way across because you couldn't steer the course. The ship wouldn't allow it. Terrific. I thought we weren't going to get through this. It's just going to be curtains like.
Having found her allotted position at the head of the safe channel, Medusa struggled not to drift from that vital spot.
The idea of her staying on station 30 hours, which she did, in foul weather in the middle of the channel, it really doesn't bear thinking about.
Then finally, as the D-Day invasion fleet drew near, the moment came for Medusa and the other HDMLs to activate the untested Decker Radar.
After 30 hours, a message comes through and the officers switched on the equipment.
It worked. But with very few decker sets in operation, this high-tech piece of equipment had to be backed up by a simple case of follow the leader.
So many ships had the equipment on to pick the beam up, and the advanced ship, which was a lead ship, and about 10 or 12 boats behind, all following it.
The whole D-Day fleet consisted of 6,000 vessels, and they were dependent on perhaps 20 of these.
Medusa's crew now had a ringside seat as the invasion fleet passed by them. She had successfully carried out her vital role. Responsibility for the operation's success now passed to the biggest ships of D-Day. To take the 5 invasion beaches, the Allies would have to deal with the deadly menace of the Atlantic Wall. A string of formidable German defences would need to be put out of action before the vast number of troops could land. This vital task was given to the Allied warships.
They were there to give German resistance a real pasting.
At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, scores of ships were in position 6 miles off the Normandy coast. At 5:27, the bombardment began. For the X-craft crews, waiting just offshore with their navigation lights and beacons switched on, this was their first clue of the true scale of D-Day.
The big battleship started firing over the top of us, and that was a spectacular sound and noise. I mean, they did literally whistle. And they were landing on the beach, you know, which was 300 yards away from us.
One of the first ships to open fire is now in more peaceful surroundings. This is the Royal Navy's light cruiser, HMS Belfast. Included in Belfast's armament were 12 6-inch guns used to target gun batteries above Gold and Juno beaches. The blast from these guns was a reassuring sound for the nervous troops now heading for the shore. To the west, the most heavily defended of the 5 beaches, Omaha, was being bombarded by a veteran of the First World War, the battleship USS Texas.
Texas is one of the last remaining ships in the world that served in both World War I and World War II. There's a handful, but she's really the biggest, baddest one.
The Texas is armed with 10 14-inch guns, capable of sending 1,500-pound shells up to 12 miles.
The process of firing this gun involved getting one of the rounds per gun and 4 powder bags up and loaded. The powder bags are 105 pounds apiece. They were manhandled by sailors. So get the round up through this elevator right here, and then it rolls into a little tray, and then they have a powder ram that pushes that round all the way into the breech. Next comes the 4 powder bags, and they're pushed in. They actually use the old ramming sticks that you'll see from 18th century cannons. Once that was done, they would close the breech and be ready to fire.
Unlike artillery on land, warships had to contend with the rolling ocean. Accuracy was difficult, but Texas had the technology to deal with that problem.
No matter what you figure out to fire, you had to basically wait until the ship was level. So when they would pull the triggers to fire, there was one little switch that waited until the ship got level, and that would close the circuit and fire the guns. That way you weren't firing into the water or too high.
In 1944, the ship's bombardments of the coast lay the ground for the invasion of Omaha Beach.
As dawn began to break, we received the signal and headed into shore. I remember the battleship Texas firing broadside after broadside inland when we were close by. It was god-awful. Terrible explosions, muzzle blast in our ears when they fired. The smoke ring passed us by and it was like the funnel of a tornado, growing larger and larger and finally dissipating. We actually felt the muzzle blast.
The Allies were confident that ships like Belfast and Texas could demolish the German shore defences and so save lives when the troops went ashore. In the early morning of D-Day, a fleet of ships anchored off the Normandy coast bombarded the German defences known as the Atlantic Wall. A successful bombardment would save hundreds of lives when the troops later scrambled ashore. But did the ships achieve their vital aim? The clues can be found behind beaches like Utah and Omaha. The Maisie Battery still bears the scars of D-Day.
On D-Day was 3 separate gun batteries, and their sole purpose was to repel any invasion forces coming towards the coast. So you have a long-range battery which could hit the ships, and a smaller range battery which could hit the beach. It was designed to fire at ships to stop them supporting the infantry landing, and it did a very good job for 3 days.
The Maisie Battery was designed to withstand everything the Allies could throw at it, from a bomb-proof personnel building to a reinforced concrete headquarters.
The serious size of the concrete and the structure, it was a combat building. It was designed to protect the occupants during a combat situation, and D-Day was just that. So here you have a solid concrete construction, 3 or 4 metres thick, and then they've coated it here with the black bitumen to waterproof it. This is 70 odd years old and it's still as good as the day it was made because it really, really is impervious to bombardment.
The complexity of the battery made it a difficult target for the Allied ships to destroy. Not only did the battery survive, it turned the tables on the invasion fleet.
In one particular instance, there's a naval report saying from the US Navy that we are being fired upon by the batteries at Maisie. We're going to have to reverse out and go further out to sea to get out of its range.
The Allies' initial naval bombardment was only a partial success, and many German gun batteries survived. Despite this, hundreds of landing craft, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, continued to make their way towards the shore. Just ahead of them, though, the Allies were about to lay on their biggest surprise. At 6:25 a.m. on D-Day, vessels emerged from the water that were unlike anything ever used in the history of warfare. These were duplex drives, the tanks that swam. This is one of the very few duplex drives to survive the Second World War. This strange tank was developed because 2 years earlier, there had been a national humiliation. The 1942 Allied raid on Dieppe had been a costly failure, partly because of a lack of supporting firepower. The strategy at D-Day would therefore be very different.
The idea was that you would have tanks coming up the beach along with the very first wave of infantry, which meant, of course, that the tanks themselves had to be amphibious.
It took a masterstroke of lateral thinking to come up with a tank that could make its own way ashore. An inventor named Nicholas Strausler believed he had the answer. His company designed both collapsible boats and armoured vehicles. Strausler built a prototype by adapting a Valentine tank, the workhorse of the British North Africa campaign. His creation was given the name duplex drive, DD for short, because it could be powered by the dual methods of propellers or tracks. The tank had to fit on a landing craft, so any flotation device had to be compact. Strausler came up with an ingenious screen.
The screen is attached to the hull, and below the screen the hull is made waterproof with various mastic type materials. It's inflated with compressed air. These become rigid, lift the frames, and the canvas acts as a barrier to the water, and the machine floats with the top of the turret just about level with the water surface. When you're afloat, you have that extension pipe which blows the smoke out from the screen. There's a drain here, runs down to the rear of the tank, and any water that comes inside the screen eventually goes down, goes to the rear where there's a bilge pump. The driver is the one who really needs to be courageous, because he's down inside the hull, under the water surface. He's the one who's going to go down in the vehicle if it sinks.
There was further danger for the driver. If the tank made it to shore, the screen blocked his view. Again, the designers had a solution.
There's a small but vital fitting here, which has got a rubber bulb on the inside, which the driver can see. And when this is in water, that bulb is inflated like a balloon. When the water level drops below there, the bulb deflates, and the driver knows that he's then sufficiently on dry land to drop the screen.
At first, tank crews practiced on the calm water of inland lakes. Then they transferred to the Solent, making the 3,000-yard run from Gosport to the Isle of Wight.
Sometimes the crews arrived on the beach with the driver up to his chest in water, the thing just about afloat.
Several crews were not so lucky. At least 10 DD tanks are known to have sunk off the British coast during training exercises.
I can't imagine how anybody could risk their life in one of these. You're actually hanging below the water surface in a steel box which is supported only on canvas.
By June 1944, most duplex drives were now modified American Sherman tanks. The Normandy invasion would see them used in battle for the first time. The night before D-Day, tank landing ships, or LSTs, carried 290 DDs across the Channel and close to the Normandy coast. The final few thousand yards would be up to the tanks themselves.
It was a good idea because it could get tanks ashore before you had to risk the big LSTs under the artillery of German shore batteries.
At 5:55 the following morning, the first 29 DD tanks were launched by the Americans off Omaha Beach.
Gunfire, shots, casualties, bombing. It would be a terrifying experience.
Then terror turned to disaster. The tanks had been launched almost 3 miles out, and the sea was rough. Waves off Omaha reached 6 feet in height. 27 of those first 29 tanks sank like stones.
The problem was the weather was such that they could not function. They were fine in the tests in still water, but this was not still water, and most of them went straight to the bottom with their crews inside and never made it to shore.
On the British and Canadian beaches, there was greater success.
The British brought them much closer inshore, and they lost ones and twos, and they were successful in the sense that the troops had heavy support with their initial contact with the Germans.
On the beach, I gave orders to deflate the canvas skirt, and what happened next will always remain vivid in my memory. The German machine gunners in the dunes were absolutely stupefied to see a tank emerging from the sea. Some of them ran away, some just stood and stared, unable to believe their eyes. We mowed them down like they were corn on the cobs.
Racing towards the coastline, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers prepared to storm the beaches. On the morning of the 6th of June 1944, nearly 3,000 vessels were getting into position off the Normandy beaches. The D-Day invasion was about to begin. And until French soil was reached, the fate of thousands of men rested with their landing craft personnel, the hundreds of boats known as LCPs. The most famous of the D-Day vessels was also amongst the smallest, and its origins lay 5,000 miles away in the wetlands of Louisiana. The LCP was designed by Andrew Higgins. By 1944, it was said his ships were so important, Adolf Hitler called him the new Noah. Higgins supposedly had an armed guard outside his New Orleans home to protect him from German assassins.
Andrew Jackson Higgins was an interesting personality. He had created shallow draft boats, which he called Eureka boats, for trappers who worked in the Louisiana bayous. And the U.S. Marines saw these and said, oh, these would be interesting, and ordered a bunch of them. Originally, they were simply plywood boxes with an external motor, 36 feet long. They could hold 36 soldiers at a time who would climb out over the thwarts and then run ashore.
In 1943, the design had become the landing craft personnel. For the GIs, they were known simply as Higgins boats. The LCP was designed to push up onto beaches, protecting its occupants with its bulletproof front ramp, until the time came for it to drop. But it wasn't designed for the rough seas of the English Channel. Most of the invasion troops were in bad shape as they approached the shore.
Some of these boys had been in their landing craft for many, many, many hours. Some of them would now be beyond seasick. Some of them probably to the point they were so sick actually they'd almost given up caring.
Loaded down like pack mules, we were bounced around and thrown about while throwing up everything we'd eaten for days. Scared as hell and sicker than the devil, we were drenched with salt water with every dip and bob of the landing boat. My glasses became covered with salt spray, making it difficult to see.
The LCP wasn't the only Higgins design on D-Day. The US Navy asked him to produce a similar vessel, which would give direct beach access to a standard tank. This time, Higgins took his inspiration from a river barge. His men pulled it apart, gave it a ramp, and only 3 days later showed the Navy that it would be strong enough for the task. The result was the landing craft tank. The Navy was so impressed with the LCT that more and more were demanded. So Higgins took over the streets around his factory. Landing craft were even built on the pavement. But Higgins' relationship with the US Navy wasn't always smooth. He was a man used to getting what he wanted.
He often feuded with the Navy, which he thought closed-minded and not very innovative. It wouldn't accept many of his ideas, but nevertheless, they managed to get along enough so that he could produce 5,000 or 10,000 of these Higgins boats for the various invasions, not only at Normandy and D-Day, but the many invasions on the islands in the Pacific as well.
Alongside the LCPs and LCTs on D-Day were many different types of landing craft. Some carried 120,000 tons of cargo. Some carried more than one tank, and some over 200 soldiers. Finally, after 2 days of waiting, it was time for Jim Booth and the rest of the X-Craft crews to guide the ships to the British and Canadian beaches.
We realized that it was so easy for all those tank landing craft to have hit the wrong beach, having come across the channel. There's a very strong tide up and down, east and west, and they had to come across north and south, of all things, and they had no navigation equipment to speak of, just to hit the wrong beach. And it would have been, they would have probably won in the end and got ashore, but it would have been certainly a lot of more casualties.
The Higgins boats were successful in bringing troops to the beach, but they offered only limited protection. The men that landed at Omaha at 6:30 a.m. on D-Day faced danger on all sides.
Once the ramp goes down, you're faced with surf, and the landing craft is still moving forward. One misstep, it could run over you. There's water spouting with machine gun bullets. You have a backpack which is weighing you down. You stagger into the surf. You've got to get across that beach, and you've got to do it in the machine gun fire. But you can imagine the casualties and the drownings, and even some of those who were there, I guess, spent the rest of their lives just amazed that they did it and survived. I think it's quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary.
Despite the casualties, D-Day was a success. Beachheads were secured along a 50-mile front. By midnight, Operation Neptune had brought 150,000 men, 9,000 vehicles, and 2,000 tons of stores to France. It was the critical start needed that would set up Operation Overlord and the liberation of Europe.
I want to emphasize this, that the key to having maritime power, naval power, is not that you can deposit 100, 150,000, 200,000 men on a defended beach and seize that beach. You then have to supply them. You have to bring them ammunition and food and water and sustenance, and you have to reinforce them and bring in another 100,000, 200,000, 500,000, a million and a half, and you have to do it on a constant basis, back and forth across the English Channel, day after day, week after week, month after month. And it's that capability that is really stunning.
D-Day is rightly remembered for the brave troops who battled for a foothold on the Normandy beaches. But their heroism would not have been possible without the years of planning and preparation that brought them there. The diverse and ingenious vessels that bravely crossed the Channel on the 6th of June changed the course of the war. D-Day remains an event unparalleled in history.